5 years ago, I walked out of my parents' house in Concord, Massachusetts with $300 in cash and one suitcase. Before I even reached the city limits, my mother was already making phone calls. She told our neighbors, our relatives, and my friends that I had suffered a mental break and run away to avoid being institutionalized. She told everyone I was unstable. She told them I was a danger to myself. Last Thursday night, I was sipping sparkling water at a corporate charity gala in downtown Boston. I was wearing a tailored suit. I was the account director for the firm sponsoring the event. And then I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around and saw Mrs. Gable, the woman who lived next door to my family for my entire childhood. I had not seen a single person from my past in 5 years. Before I tell you what she handed me, and the secret that unraveled my family's 5-year lie, overnight, please take a second to hit the like and subscribe button. But only do it if you know what it feels like to be the family scapegoat. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are listening from tonight. When I saw Mrs. Gable standing near the ice sculpture, my stomach dropped. I braced myself. I expected the pitying look people give you when they have been told you lost your mind. I expected her to ask if I was taking my medication. Instead, she looked around the crowded ballroom, grabbed my arm, and pulled me aside. Her eyes were sharp. "They lied to everyone, Ariana," she whispered. "And I have the proof." She handed me a sealed manila envelope. "To understand what was inside it, you need to understand the night I left. Let me take you back to a Tuesday in November 5 years ago. Concord is the kind of town where expensive landscaping hides ugly realities. My mother, Brenda, ruled our house by keeping everyone off balance. My father, David, treated silence like a survival strategy. And my older sister, Jessica, was the golden child. Jessica could burn the house down, and Brenda would blame me for buying the matches. That Tuesday, I found out Jessica had stolen my social security number. She used it to open a credit card and racked up $8,000 in charges to cover her own debts. I printed the billing statement, walked into the kitchen, and put the paper on the granite counter. I expected my mother to yell at her. I expected my father to finally speak up. Jessica just sat at the table, scrolling on her phone. Brenda did not even look at the bill. She poured her coffee, set the pot down, and looked right at me. She tilted her head and used that calm, sweet voice she always used when she was rewriting reality. "You are acting manic again, Ariana," she said. "You are making up stories to get attention. Your father and I have been talking. We are going to have to look into a facility." My father stood by the sink and stared at the floor. He said nothing. That was the threat. They were going to institutionalize me to cover up my sister's credit card fraud. I did not scream. I did not argue with a wall. I went upstairs, packed my clothes into one bag, took the $300 I kept in my sock drawer, and walked out into the freezing Massachusetts rain. Let me take you inside the house on Elm Street so you can feel the exact temperature of that Tuesday night in November. Concord is a place where people care more about the symmetry of their hedges than the people living behind them. Our house was a colonial, with pristine white shutters, and a driveway that my father swept twice a week. Inside it was an emotional war zone, war. Growing up, the rules of our household were simple. Jessica was the investment. I was the insurance policy. If Jessica needed a private tutor, my college fund was drained to pay for it. If Jessica dented the bumper of my mother's car, Brenda would somehow convince my father that I had distracted her. Jessica possessed a fragile, frantic energy that Brenda fed on while I was quiet. Toxic families hate quiet children. They cannot control what they cannot hear. The mail arrived at 4 that afternoon. I usually never checked the pile on the entryway table, but a thick envelope caught my eye. It had my name on it from a platinum credit card company I had never used. My credit score was the only thing I owned that was entirely mine. I worked as a receptionist at a dental office just to keep my bank account in the black. I tore the envelope open. The balance was $8,412. I read the itemized charges standing in the hallway. High-end boutiques on Newberry Street, a resort deposit in Miami, a balance transfer from a separate account, all charged under a card linked to my social security number. The physical card had been mailed to our address a month prior, intercepted before I ever saw it. There was only one person in the house who took vacations in Miami while claiming she could not afford to pay her cell phone bill. I walked into the kitchen. The granite countertops were spotless. Brenda was chopping vegetables for a roast. My father, David, was sitting at the island reading a hardware store flyer. Jessica was perched on a stool drinking sparkling water and complaining about her spin class instructor. I placed the statement directly over my father's flyer. Then I looked at Jessica. I asked her how the weather was in Miami. Jessica did not even drop her phone. She glanced at the paper, rolled her eyes, and looked at our mother. She did not apologize. She did not deny it. She played the victim. She whined that her debts were piling up, that her ex-boyfriend had ruined her credit, and that I was being petty because I never went anywhere anyway. Identity theft is a federal crime. I said the words clearly, making sure the gravity hung in the air. I told them I was going to the police in the morning to file a fraud report. That is when the temperature in the room changed. Brenda put the knife down. She wiped her hands on a towel very slowly. She did not yell at her eldest daughter for committing a felony. She did not ask how they were going to pay the money back. She turned her focus entirely on me. "You are acting manic again, Ariana," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the velvet tone she used right before she destroyed someone. I stared at her. Manic? I had just been robbed of $8,000. You are making up stories to get attention. Brenda continued, stepping closer to me. You have been unstable for months. You are yelling. You are threatening your own sister. I think your mental health is slipping again. I looked at my father. He folded his flyer, slid off the stool, and walked to the sink. He turned his back to the room. His silence was the loudest sound in the house. It was his signature move. David would rather watch his youngest daughter be psychologically dismantled than face the wrath of his wife. Brenda placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder. Jessica was actually smiling, a tight, secret little smile. Your father and I have been talking, Brenda said. We think you are a danger to yourself. If you go to the police with these paranoid delusions, they will see exactly how sick you are. We are going to have to look into a residential facility. We can have you committed for an evaluation. The floor seemed to drop out from under my feet. This was not a standard argument. This was a tactical strike. Brenda was outlining her defense strategy. If I reported the fraud, she would testify to the authorities that I was having a psychiatric break. She would use her status as a respected Concord mother to have me placed on a psychiatric hold. She would lock me in a hospital ward, drug me into submission, and legally classify me as incompetent, all to ensure Jessica did not get a criminal record. They were willing to throw my entire life into an incinerator to keep Jessica warm. Panic is a useless emotion when you are dealing with predators. You cannot fight an architect of lies by crying. Tears just prove to them that you are broken. I realized in that split second that I was standing in a room with 3 strangers who would gladly watch me drown. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I nodded once, picked up the statement from the counter, and walked upstairs. Brenda called after me, telling me to calm down and take a pill. She thought she had won. She thought the threat of a mental ward had terrified me into compliance. I went into my bedroom and locked the door. I pulled a canvas duffel bag from the closet. I did not pack photographs or yearbooks or childhood trinkets. Nostalgia is a luxury you cannot afford when you are running for your life. I packed thermal shirts, heavy socks, a winter coat, and my laptop. I went to the bottom drawer of my dresser, dug past the old sweaters, and pulled out an envelope. Inside was $300 in cash. I had been saving it from tip money and odd jobs, $10 at a time for emergencies. This was the emergency. I zipped the bag. I looked around the bedroom I had slept in for 2 decades. I realized I was leaving behind the girl who tried to earn their love. She died in the kitchen 5 minutes ago. I walked down the stairs. The television was on in the living room. I could hear Jessica laughing at a commercial. I walked out the front door and closed it so quietly the latch barely clicked. The November air hit my lungs like shattered glass. It was raining, a freezing, miserable Massachusetts downpour that soaked through my coat before I even reached the end of the driveway. I did not have a car. My name was not on any vehicle title. I had my boots, my duffel bag, and a 3-mile walk to the commuter rail station. I walked along the shoulder of the road, keeping my head down against the wind. Every time headlights swept past me, my stomach clenched, thinking it was David coming to drag me back. But the road stayed empty. They did not even realize I was gone until the next morning. I reached the station shivering and handed the ticket clerk $30 in damp cash. I bought a one-way ticket to South Boston. Sitting on the hard plastic seat of the train as it rattled through the dark, I looked at my reflection in the window. I had no job lined up. My credit was ruined. I had $270 left to my name. I was 23 years old and alone in the world. But as the train pulled further away from Concord, I realized something else. My chest did not feel tight anymore. The constant suffocating pressure of waiting for the next betrayal was gone. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought walking out the door was the victory. I was naive. You see, a toxic family does not just let their scapegoat walk away. When the designated punching bag removes itself from the house, the family system collapses. They need you to be the villain so they can be the victims. I did not know it as I sat on that train, but Brenda was not sleeping. She was already drafting the narrative. She was preparing to launch a campaign so vicious it would erase my name from the town entirely. The physical escape cost me $300. The reputation escape was going to cost me 5 years of my life. Before I had even signed a lease for a basement room in the city, Brenda made her first phone call. Here's what nobody warns you about going no contact with a toxic family. The silence on your end is peaceful. The noise on their end is deafening. I spent my first 48 hours in a basement sublet in South Boston. I found the room on an online message board during my train ride. It smelled like damp concrete and bleach. My bed was a mattress on the floor, pushed against a cinder block wall. I spent those first 2 days sleeping exhausted from the sheer adrenaline of my escape. I thought I had bought myself some time to figure out my next move. I underestimated my mother. Brenda did not take time to grieve her youngest daughter running away into the freezing rain. She went straight to work. In a wealthy town like Concord, reputation is the local currency. Brenda knew that my sudden absence would raise questions at the country club, at the neighborhood association meetings, and during her weekly book club. She needed a cover story. She needed a narrative that made her the victim and me the villain. And she constructed it with chilling efficiency. I learned about her campaign through a voicemail. On my 3rd day in the basement, my phone rang. It was my cousin Lauren. I let it go to voicemail because I was terrified Brenda was sitting in the room with her. I sat on my mattress, pulled my knees to my chest, and pressed play. Lauren sounded frantic. She said Brenda had called our extended family in tears. According to my mother, I had suffered a severe psychotic break. Brenda told everyone that I had stolen $8,000 from Jessica to fund a manic episode. When my loving, concerned parents tried to intervene and get me professional psychiatric help, I became aggressive. I threatened them. Then I ran away like a fugitive to avoid being institutionalized. I listened to the voicemail 3 times. The precision of the lie took my breath away. Brenda took the exact crime Jessica committed against me, the credit card fraud, and flipped the roles. She projected Jessica's theft onto my record. By telling everyone I was deeply unstable, she ensured that even if I tried to tell the truth, no one would believe me. Any accusation I made against Jessica would just be written off as the paranoid rambling of a sick mind. Brenda played the role of the tragic, long-suffering mother beautifully. I later heard from an old high school acquaintance how my mother performed at the local grocery store. Brenda would stand near the floral department, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, telling the neighbors how worried sick she was about her missing, troubled daughter. The town rallied around her. The neighbors brought over sympathy casseroles. Brenda collected baked ziti and roasted chickens like trophies. She wore my supposed insanity like a badge of honor. My first instinct was to fight back. I wanted to take screenshots of the credit card statements. I wanted to post them online. I wanted to call Lauren and scream the truth into the phone. I wanted to hire a lawyer and drag Jessica into a courtroom to expose the fraud. But I sat in that damp basement, and I forced myself to think clearly. When you are dealing with an architect of lies, defending yourself is a trap. If I reached out to defend myself, I would be handing Brenda the exact building materials she needed. If I called my relatives crying and yelling, Brenda would point to my anger as proof of my instability. "See how manic she is," she would say. "See how aggressive she has become." Furthermore, going to the police about the identity theft was a dead end. I had called a legal aid clinic that morning. The paralegal told me that pursuing criminal charges against a family member for a credit card opened in the same household is a bureaucratic nightmare. The police often dismiss it as a civil family dispute. If I pushed it, I would have to show up in court. I would have to stand in the same room as Brenda, David, and Jessica. They would use their money and their Concord lawyers to bury me. I would be dragged right back into the cage I had just escaped. I made the hardest decision of my life that night. I put my phone down. I did not call Lauren back. I did not post a single word online. I blocked every phone number connected to my past. I let them have the story. I traded my reputation for my freedom. While Brenda was sipping wine at her book club and receiving pity for her broken daughter, I was trying to figure out how to survive. The $300 I brought with me was gone in a week, swallowed by the security deposit for the sublet and a few groceries. I had nothing. The physical reality of my new life was punishing. I lived on a diet of ramen noodles and cheap peanut butter. The radiator in my room was broken, so I slept in my winter coat during the worst of the December snowstorms. I walked 2 miles in the slush to a diner where I begged the manager for a job waiting tables. But the hardest part was the anchor tied around my ankle. The $8,400 credit card bill. The bank did not care that my sister had stolen my identity. My name was on the account. The interest was compounding. My credit score, the only pristine thing I had carried out of that house, was plummeting. If I let the account go into default, I would never be able to rent a real apartment. I would never pass a background check for a corporate job. Jessica had not just stolen my money. She had stolen my ability to participate in normal society. I realized that escaping Concord was only the first step. The Coleman family had handed me a shovel and buried me in a hole. If I wanted to see the sun again, I was going to have to dig myself out dollar by agonizing dollar. I had to pay off a debt I did not owe, working minimum wage shifts while the people who put me there slept in luxury. I needed every ounce of my energy just to keep breathing. I could not waste a single drop of it on anger or revenge. I tied my apron strings tight. I took orders. I wiped down sticky tables. I counted my tips in quarters and dimes. I was at the absolute bottom. But the thing about hitting the rock floor of the ocean is that it gives you something solid to push off from. I was done running. It was time to start the climb. The reality of starting over is not a movie montage playing to an upbeat pop song. There is no magical sequence where you suddenly have a new wardrobe and a corner office. The reality of starting over from nothing is brutal and exhausting math. It is waking up at 5 in the morning when the sky is still pitch black. It is counting the exact number of quarters you have left for the laundromat. It is memorizing the bus schedule because missing the 6:15 means you lose an hour of pay. Before I could build a real life, I had to deal with the anchor my sister tied around my neck. The $8,412 credit card debt. During my second week in South Boston, I walked into a local police precinct. I waited on a hard wooden bench for 2 hours to speak with a detective. I brought the credit card statement and my birth certificate. I sat across from a tired man with coffee stains on his tie and explained that my sister had stolen my identity. He looked at the paperwork side and gave me a crash course in the reality of the American legal system. He told me that because the card was mailed to my primary legal residence and because the thief was an immediate family member, the district attorney would likely decline to press criminal charges. The police view these situations as civil family disputes. He told me I would have to hire a lawyer, file a civil suit against Jessica, and drag my parents into court to testify. The legal fees alone would cost more than the debt itself. Furthermore, the credit card company would freeze my credit entirely during the years-long litigation process. I walked out of that precinct with a bitter pill to swallow. Justice is a luxury product, and I could not afford it. If I wanted my freedom, I was going to have to buy it back from the bank myself. I needed a second income. The diner tips were barely covering my rent and groceries. I scoured the classifieds and found an entry-level opening at a freight logistics company near the shipyards. They needed an administrative assistant. The pay was low, the hours were rigid, and the office was a gray cubicle farm located in a warehouse district. I interviewed on a Tuesday morning wearing a thrift store blazer that was one size too big. I got the job because I was the only applicant willing to work the early shift starting at 6 in the morning. For the next 2 years, my life was a relentless pendulum swinging between two extremes. I woke up at 5. I took the bus to the logistics firm. From 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, I managed freight manifests, tracked shipping containers, and answered phones for irritable truck drivers. The logistics industry is unforgiving. If a shipment of perishable goods is delayed by 4 hours, thousands of dollars are lost. The floor managers yelled, the dispatchers panicked, but I stayed perfectly calm. Every time a crisis erupted, I handled it with a steady voice and a clear head. My boss was a tough, seasoned operations manager named Sarah. After my 3rd month, she pulled me into her office. She told me she had never seen a 23-year-old handle high-pressure scheduling conflicts with such cold efficiency. She asked me where I learned to de-escalate angry people so well. I just smiled and told her I had a lot of practice at home. I was proving my mother wrong every single day. Brenda told the entire town of Concord that I was manic and incapable of functioning in society. Yet here I was, keeping a multi-million-dollar supply chain, moving without breaking a sweat. At 2:30, I clocked out of the logistics firm. I took the train across the river to Cambridge. I tied an apron around my waist and worked the dinner shift at the diner until 11 at night. I carried heavy trays of burgers and coffee. I smiled at rude college students. I scrubbed grease off the griddle until my knuckles bled. I lived on a budget so strict it would make an accountant flinch. For 2 full years, I did not buy a single piece of new clothing. When my winter boots cracked, I taped the seams with duct tape. I ate the mistakes the kitchen made at the diner. If a customer ordered a turkey sandwich and sent it back because it had tomatoes on it, that was my dinner. Every single dollar I saved went directly to the credit card company. There were moments when the exhaustion almost broke me. The hardest night was my first Thanksgiving alone. The diner was closed. The logistics office was closed. I was sitting on the floor of my basement sublet. The radiator was making a terrible hissing sound. I was eating a bowl of rice and staring at the blank wall. I thought about the dining room table back in Concord. I thought about the warm glow of the chandelier, the roasted turkey, the expensive wine, and the laughter. I picked up my phone. I dialed the first 6 digits of my parents' home number. My thumb hovered over the call button. I rationalized it in my head. I told myself that if I just apologized, if I just admitted I was wrong, Brenda would let me come back. I could sleep in a real bed. I could have a hot meal. I could stop working 16 hours a day. The pull of the toxic family is like gravity. When you are freezing and exhausted, even a cage looks like a shelter. Then I looked down at my bank account app on my phone. The balance was $34. I looked around my ugly, damp, cramped room. I realized something profound sitting on that concrete floor. This ugly room was mine. The $34 was mine. The silence was mine. I put the phone down. I understood then what my mother had done to me my entire life. Brenda had spent 2 decades convincing me I was fragile. She constantly told me I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too weak to handle the real world. She did this so I would never realize how strong I actually was. She needed me to believe I was incapable of surviving without her. More importantly, the family needed me to be the broken one, so Jessica could look whole. Jessica was a chaotic, irresponsible adult who stole from her own sister. But as long as Ariana was the crazy runaway, Jessica looked like the successful daughter by comparison. I was the dark background they used to make the golden child shine. I deleted their phone number from my contacts. I never hovered over the dial button again. I channeled every ounce of my residual anger into momentum. I realized that surviving was not enough. I wanted to thrive. I took the small amount of free time I had on Sunday mornings and enrolled in online night classes at a local community college. I studied project management. I sat at my tiny kitchen table with a second-hand laptop and learned about resource allocation, budget forecasting, and risk management. I treated my own life like a corporate project. The objective was financial independence. The risk was my family. The timeline was non-negotiable. Month by month, the credit card balance dropped. 8,000, 6,000, 3,000, 1,000. The day the balance hit zero, I was sitting in the break room at the logistics firm. I received the confirmation email from the bank, account paid in full, status closed. I stared at the screen for a long time. I did not throw a party. I did not buy a bottle of champagne. I just took a deep breath, walked back to my desk, and asked my boss, Sarah, for a promotion. I told her I had my project management certificate. I told her I knew the supply chain better than anyone else on the floor. I told her I wanted to be an account coordinator. She gave me the job on the spot. That was the turning point. That was the moment I stopped running from my past and started building my future. I quit the diner in Cambridge. I moved out of the damp basement in South Boston and signed a lease for a small, clean apartment with windows that actually let the sunlight in. I was no longer the terrified girl running through the freezing rain. I spent the next 2 years climbing the corporate ladder with a quiet, ruthless focus. I was building a fortress brick by brick. I thought I had made myself untouchable. I thought I had put a permanent wall between my new life and the lies of Concord, Massachusetts. But I forgot the golden rule of escaping a toxic system. Just because you stop looking over your shoulder does not mean they have stopped hunting you. And the universe has a very funny way of testing your fortress just when you think the mortar has dried. By year 4, the tide did not just turn. It pulled me out of the survival current and placed me on solid ground. I took the project management skills I learned at the logistics firm and leveraged them into a new industry. I applied for a mid-level position at a premier corporate event planning agency in downtown Boston. Event planning sounds glamorous to people who have never done it. In reality, it is a high-stakes exercise in crisis management. It requires anticipating disasters before they happen, reading the shifting moods of demanding clients, and maintaining a flat, calm demeanor while the world burns around you. I was a natural. Growing up in the Coleman household was the ultimate training ground for managing high-maintenance people. I knew how to read a room the second I walked into it. I knew how to de-escalate a panicked corporate sponsor because I spent my childhood de-escalating Brenda. I treated angry catering vendors the same way I treated my sister. I gave them boundaries, I gave them solutions, and I never let them see me sweat. Within 14 months, the agency promoted me to account director. The title came with a salary that changed the geometry of my life. I was no longer doing the brutal math of poverty. I stopped counting the quarters in my pocket. I set up a retirement account and watched the balance grow. I moved out of the cramped sublets and signed a lease for a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in Brookline. Let me tell you about that apartment. It had original hardwood floors, high ceilings, and large windows that faced a tree-lined street. I turned the second bedroom into a home office. I bought real furniture. Not milk crates, not thrift store cast-offs, but a velvet sofa and a heavy oak dining table. I watered my potted plants on Sunday mornings while drinking expensive coffee. The silence in that apartment was not the tense, suffocating quiet of my parents' house in Concord, where silence meant someone was plotting. The silence in my Brookline apartment was just peace. It belonged to me. I also built something more important than a savings account. I built a chosen family. When you grow up as the designated scapegoat, you are conditioned to believe that love is transactional. You believe people will only tolerate you if you make yourself small and useful. It takes a long time to unlearn that lie. I started letting people in slowly. I made friends with my colleagues. I met a woman named Elena, a graphic designer who shared my dark sense of humor. I became close with Mark, a vendor coordinator who invited me to his family holiday dinners so I would not have to spend them alone. We had Friday night dinners at my oak table. We drank wine, told stories, and laughed until our ribs ached. Nobody monitored my tone. Nobody accused me of being manic if I spoke too passionately about a movie or a book. My chosen family did not ask me to shrink. They respected my mind. They celebrated my promotions. They proved to me that a healthy dynamic is not built on control, it is built on mutual respect. This new life brought me the ultimate prize: indifference. In the first few years of going no contact, the separation requires active energy. You have to force yourself not to check their social media. You have to fight the urge to defend yourself against the smear campaign. The anger keeps you warm, but it also keeps you chained to them. By year 4, the chain rusted and snapped. The anger faded away, leaving a quiet, empty void where the trauma used to be. I realized one afternoon that I had not searched my mother's name online in over 2 years. I did not know if David had retired. I did not know if Jessica was married, or if she was bankrupt, or if her reckless behavior had finally landed her in a jail cell. I simply did not care. Toxic people feed on your emotional reactions. They want your love, but they will gladly settle for your hatred. Both require your attention. Total indifference is the one thing they cannot manipulate. I had achieved it. I was no longer the runaway daughter. I was Ariana, an account director, with a passport, a stock portfolio, and a calendar full of dinner plans. I was busy living. But the universe has a very precise sense of irony. It waits until you have reinforced all your walls, until you have furnished your safe room and locked the door. Then it tests the foundation. That test arrived on a Thursday night in late October. My firm was sponsoring a major charity gala for a local housing initiative. We rented out the grand ballroom of a historic hotel near the harbor. The guest list included city officials, real estate developers, and wealthy philanthropists from across the state. My job was to oversee the flow of the evening. I was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal pantsuit and a pair of heels that cost more than my entire first month of rent in South Boston. My hair was pulled back. I held a clipboard for the first 3 hours of the event, directing the catering staff, cueing the string quartet, and ensuring the keynote speakers hit their marks. The execution was flawless. By 9 o'clock, the formal presentation ended. The jazz band started playing, the donors started writing checks, and the atmosphere shifted into a relaxed celebration. I handed my clipboard to my assistant. I walked over to the open bar, ordered a glass of chilled Chardonnay, and stood near a towering swan ice sculpture. I took a sip of the wine and looked out over the ballroom. I felt a deep, resonant pride. I belonged in this room. I helped build this night. Then I felt a distinct tap on my left shoulder. I turned around expecting to see a client needing a taxi or a venue manager asking about the lighting. Instead, I found myself looking at a ghost. It was Mrs. Gable. She was wearing a dark blue evening gown, holding a clutch purse in both hands. She was a decade older than the last time I saw her, her hair now entirely silver, but her posture was exactly the same. Mrs. Gable lived in the massive brick colonial directly next door to my parents' house in Concord. She was the woman who watched me grow up. She was the woman who watered our plants when we went on vacation. She was the prime audience member for Brenda's neighborhood smear campaign. The glass of Chardonnay suddenly felt very heavy in my hand. The air in my lungs froze. 5 years of carefully constructed peace threatened to shatter in a single second. My mind raced through a dozen different defensive strategies. I braced myself for the judgment. I expected her to look at me with the same cautious pity you give to a stray dog. I expected her to ask me if I was taking my medication. I prepared myself to hear the echo of my mother's lies. But Mrs. Gable did not look at me with pity. Her eyes were wide, sharp, and intensely focused. She looked around the crowded ballroom, scanning the guests as if making sure no one was listening. She stepped closer to me, invading my personal space. She reached out and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She did not ask me how I was doing. She did not make small talk about the weather or the gala. She leaned in, her voice cutting straight through the jazz music and the clinking glasses. "They lied to everyone, Ariana," she whispered. "And I have the proof." She reached into her dark blue clutch and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. She pressed it against my chest, forcing me to take it. I stared at the heavy paper in my hands. The seal was unbroken. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was inside this envelope was going to drag me straight back to the town I had spent 5 years running away from. I stood near the swan ice sculpture with the heavy manila envelope pressed against my chest. The jazz band was playing a cheerful, upbeat tempo. The ballroom was full of wealthy donors laughing and holding expensive drinks, but for me, the temperature in the room had just plummeted to freezing. I looked at the thick paper in my hands. It felt radioactive. For a fraction of a second, my survival instincts kicked in. My brain screamed at me to hand the envelope back, to turn around, and to walk out the front doors of the hotel. I had spent 5 years building a safe, quiet life. I had achieved the rare prize of total indifference. I did not want to know what my mother was doing. I did not want to know how the people in Concord, Massachusetts were living their lives. I looked up at Mrs. Gable. She did not look like a woman who had just crashed a corporate charity event. She looked like a woman who had arrived to execute a search warrant. Growing up, Mrs. Gable was a fixture on our street. She lived in the large brick colonial directly next door to our house. She was a retired county clerk. She was a widow who spent her days tending to an immaculate rose garden that bordered our property line. Because she was always in her garden, she saw everything. She saw my father retreating into his garage to avoid conflict. She saw Jessica throwing tantrums in the driveway. And she saw Brenda standing on our front porch, pointing her finger at me, delivering her quiet, devastating lectures. Mrs. Gable used to watch me pull weeds in our yard while my mother criticized my every move. She never intervened back then. She just watched from behind her rose bushes with a tight, unreadable expression. Now she was standing in downtown Boston, holding a clutch purse, staring at me with that same unreadable expression. "You look beautiful, Ariana," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was steady and measured. She studied my face, taking in my tailored suit, my neat hair, and my calm posture. "You look sane." The word hit me like a physical strike to the jaw. Sane. My grip tightened around the stem of my wine glass. My shoulders locked into place. I felt the familiar burning heat of defensiveness rise in my chest. For 5 years I had outrun the stigma my mother had attached to my name. Hearing that word spoken out loud in my professional sanctuary felt like a violation. I opened my mouth to tell her to leave. I was ready to call security and have her escorted out of the building. Mrs. Gable held up her hand before I could speak a single word. "I am sorry," she said quickly. Her eyes softened just a fraction. "That was a cruel thing to say, but you need to understand the picture your mother painted of you. Brenda did not just tell the neighborhood that you were a little troubled. She convinced the entire town that you had lost your grip on reality. She told everyone you were a danger to society. She made people pity her for having to endure such a tragic, unstable daughter." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew Brenda had launched a smear campaign. I knew she had lied, but hearing the depth of the deception from an outside source made the reality stark and ugly. "Why are you here, Mrs. Gable?" I asked. My voice was low and tight. "How did you even find me?" She pointed toward the large welcome banner hanging above the ballroom entrance. The banner listed the corporate sponsors for the housing initiative. My firm was listed at the top. "I bought a ticket to this gala," Mrs. Gable said. "I paid $1,000 for a seat at a table I do not care about, just to find you. You are not an easy person to track down, Ariana. You scrubbed your digital footprint well. But I saw your company name on the sponsor list, and I took a gamble." I looked at the envelope in my hands. A woman on a fixed retirement income does not pay $1,000 for a charity ticket just to deliver neighborhood gossip. "What is this?" I asked, tracing the sealed edge of the paper. Mrs. Gable stepped closer. The scent of her expensive floral perfume cut through the smell of the banquet food. "You always thought your mother drove you out of the house that night to cover up Jessica's credit card fraud. You thought Brenda threatened you with a psychiatric facility just to protect her golden child from a felony charge." I nodded. That was the truth. It was the entire reason I fled into the rain. "That was just a convenient excuse," Mrs. Gable whispered. Her eyes locked onto mine. "Brenda used the credit card fraud as an opportunity. She needed you legally discredited. She needed a documented paper trail claiming you were mentally unfit to handle your own affairs. She needed you out of that house and out of your right mind." The ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. The jazz bands sounded like they were playing underwater. I tried to process her words. Why would my mother need me legally discredited? I had nothing. I was a 23-year-old receptionist with $300 in a sock drawer. I owned nothing of value. I slid my fingernail under the flap of the envelope. I needed to see what was inside. Mrs. Gable reached out and placed her hand firmly over mine, stopping me. "Not here," she said. Her tone was authoritative, the voice of a woman who had spent decades managing legal paperwork and court schedules. "This is not a conversation for a crowded ballroom. You cannot read these documents while you are working." She pulled a small white card from her clutch and tucked it under my thumb. "Meet me tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, she said. "There is a quiet coffee shop on Charles Street in Beacon Hill. I reserved a private booth in the back. Bring the envelope. Do not open it until I am sitting across from you." I stared at her, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted answers right now. I wanted to tear the paper open and expose the lie. But Mrs. Gable was already taking a step back, melting into the crowd of wealthy donors and socialites. "Bring a pen, Ariana," she said over her shoulder, "and prepare yourself." Before I could argue, she turned and walked toward the exit doors, leaving me standing alone next to the ice sculpture. I did not stay for the rest of the gala. I handed my clipboard to my assistant, claimed I had a sudden migraine, and walked out into the cool October night. I hailed a cab and gave the driver my address in Brookline. The ride home felt like an eternity. The streetlights flashed through the windows of the cab, illuminating the thick envelope resting on my lap. I felt like I was transporting a bomb. I had spent years meticulously cleaning my life of Brenda's toxic residue. I had built a fortress. And now a retired county clerk had just walked through the front gate and handed me a weapon. When I got to my apartment, I did not turn on the main lights. I walked into my dining room, illuminated only by the street lamps outside, and placed the envelope in the exact center of my heavy oak table. I took off my tailored suit jacket. I poured myself a glass of cold water. I sat in one of the dining chairs and just stared at the sealed paper. The temptation to throw it in the trash was overwhelming. I could drop it in the incinerator chute down the hall. I could block Mrs. Gable's number, cancel the morning meeting, and pretend the entire interaction never happened. I could go back to my peaceful, indifferent existence. But I knew that was a lie. The indifference was gone. The second she uttered the words "legally discredited," the ghost of my 23-year-old self woke up. I thought about the freezing rain on the night I ran away. I thought about the endless shifts at the diner, the aching feet, the taped winter boots, and the quiet burning rage that fueled my climb out of poverty. I had paid for my freedom with blood and sweat. If my mother had orchestrated that suffering for a specific calculated reason, I owed it to myself to find out why. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark living room watching the clock on the wall tick toward morning. At 6, I showered. I put on a sharp professional blazer, the kind of armor I wore when I was negotiating difficult corporate contracts. I grabbed my purse. I picked up the manila envelope from the table. And just as the ghost at the gala had instructed, I grabbed a pen. I locked the door to my safe sanctuary and walked out into the morning air. I was heading to Beacon Hill to finally learn the true cost of my family's lies. Beacon Hill, on a Friday morning, feels like a film set. The cobblestone streets are swept clean. The brick storefronts look historic, and everyone walking past the windows seems to have a clear, uncomplicated destination. I arrived at the cafe on Charles Street at 7:45. I requested a quiet booth in the back corner, far away from the espresso machines and the morning rush. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Mrs. Gable walked through the front door precisely at 8 o'clock. She wore a beige trench coat and carried the same dark blue clutch from the gala. She slid into the leather booth across from me and placed the thick manila envelope flat on the wooden table. We did not exchange pleasantries. She did not ask how my commute was. She looked at the envelope, then looked at me, and instructed me to break the seal. My fingers felt numb as I peeled back the adhesive. I pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked legal paper. The pages were bound by a single brass clip at the top corner. I scanned the first page. The legal jargon was dense, but the bold heading at the top center was unmistakable. It read, "The Helen Coleman Irrevocable Trust." Aunt Helen was my father's older sister. Growing up, she was the only person in the Coleman family who ever treated me like a human being instead of a problem to be solved. She was a retired high school history teacher who lived in a beautiful historic Victorian property in Lexington. Helen never married. She spent her weekends tending to her garden and reading thick biographies. When my parents held their stiff, performative holiday dinners, Helen was the one who would sneak into the kitchen, hand me a novel she thought I would like, and tell me I had a sharp mind. She was my only safe harbor in a family of sharks. Helen died of pancreatic cancer 6 months before I ran away from home. I was devastated. I was 22 at the time, barely making minimum wage at the dental office. Brenda took immediate control of the estate arrangements. My mother handled the funeral, the sorting of belongings, and the legal paperwork. A few weeks after the service, Brenda sat me down at our kitchen table and delivered a tragic story. She told me Helen had been secretly drowning in debt. She claimed Helen died penniless, owing hundreds of thousands of dollars to medical creditors, and that the bank had already foreclosed on the Lexington house. I believed her. I had no reason to question it. People lose their homes to medical debt every day in America. I grieved my aunt, and I tried to forget about the beautiful Victorian house where I used to feel safe. I traced the bold letters on the legal document sitting on the cafe table. I looked across the booth at the retired county clerk. "Helen did not leave her house to the bank," Mrs. Gable said quietly. Her voice was steady, delivering the facts with the clinical precision of a courtroom judge. "She left it to you. My lungs forgot how to pull in air." I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Helen's careful, slanted cursive. Mrs. Gable leaned forward and tapped a specific paragraph on the second page. "Helen owned that property in Lexington free and clear," she explained. "There was no medical debt. There was no bank foreclosure. Helen set up a blind trust 18 months before she passed away. She named me as her executor and the sole trustee." I tried to process the geometry of the lie. Why did I not know about this? Why was I kept in the dark while I was freezing in a basement sublet in South Boston? "Helen knew exactly who your mother was," Mrs. Gable continued. "She knew that if she left you an asset outright while you were still young and living under Brenda's roof, your mother would find a way to bleed it dry or coerce you into signing it over to Jessica. So Helen built a legal firewall. She drafted the trust so that the deed to the Lexington house would not transfer into your name until your 25th birthday. She appointed me to manage the property, pay the taxes out of an escrow account, and keep the secret safe until you were old enough to defend your own territory." A chill crawled up the back of my neck. Helen had tried to save me. She had orchestrated an exit strategy for me from beyond the grave. But if this was an airtight legal firewall, why did Brenda threaten to commit me to a psychiatric ward? I voiced the question out loud. I asked Mrs. Gable how my mother found out about a blind trust. Mrs. Gable folded her hands on the table. "Helen made one mistake," she said. "She was a meticulous woman, but cancer makes people tired." During her final weeks, Helen drafted a preliminary version of her estate wishes on a legal pad. She left it tucked inside a desk drawer in her study. When Brenda volunteered to clean out the Lexington house after the funeral, she found the notepad. The puzzle pieces began snapping together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Brenda read the notes. She realized a premium piece of real estate, an asset worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, was sitting just out of reach. She knew it was earmarked for the daughter she despised. She knew that if I stayed in Concord, if I lived to see my 25th birthday, I would inherit a free and clear house. I would gain instant financial independence, and I would walk away from the family forever. Brenda could not let that happen. She needed that asset to fund Jessica's spiraling lifestyle. But an irrevocable trust, managed by a stubborn retired county clerk, is a hard target to break into. Brenda could not just forge a signature or alter the deed. The law in Massachusetts is strict. There is only one reliable legal loophole a parent can use to intercept and control an adult child's inheritance. The parent has to prove the adult child is legally incompetent. Mrs. Gable watched my eyes widen as the horrific truth landed. Yes, she whispered. Now you see it. The credit card fraud was not just a sibling dispute, it was the catalyst Brenda had been waiting for. When I walked into the kitchen that Tuesday night with the billing statement, Brenda did not see a crisis. She saw her opening. She provoked me. She tried to push me into a panic. Her threat to look into a facility was not a bluff to protect Jessica from a felony charge. It was step one of a calculated legal maneuver. Brenda needed a documented medical record of my insanity. If I had stayed in that house, if I had fought back, Brenda would have called the police and claimed I was having a violent manic episode. She would have had me placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold. Once I was locked in a hospital ward medicated and stripped of my autonomy, Brenda would have filed an emergency petition in probate court. She would have asked a judge to grant her full medical and financial guardianship over her deeply unstable daughter. And once a parent has legal guardianship over an incapacitated adult, they have the authority to petition the court to manage that adult's trust assets to pay for their ongoing care. Brenda was going to lock me in a cage and use my own aunt's house to pay for the padlock. I pushed the coffee cup away. My hands were shaking. I had spent 5 years thinking I ran away to escape a toxic environment. I did not realize I had narrowly dodged a permanent legal trap. Walking out into the rain with $300 did not just save my sanity, it saved my life. But a glaring hole in the timeline remained. I looked at Mrs. Gable. I ran away, I said. I disappeared into Boston. Brenda never got her psychiatric hold. She never got her medical documentation. She never got me into a courtroom. So what did she do? I turned 25 3 years ago. If the trust transferred to me, why am I only finding out about this today? Mrs. Gable reached into her trench coat pocket. She pulled out a secondary stack of papers folded in thirds and set them next to the trust document. Because Brenda did not stop when you ran, Mrs. Gable said. She pivoted. She could not declare you incompetent in a hospital. So she tried to declare you missing and unfit in a courtroom. And when that failed, she found a way to steal the house without ever touching the deed. Mrs. Gable tapped the new stack of papers. She leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a low, grim register. You need to read these, Ariana. You need to see the paper trail. Because your mother has been running an illegal operation out of your property for the last 3 years and the consequences are about to crash down on her head. I reached across the wooden cafe table and picked up the second stack of papers. The top sheet was a photocopy of a formal legal filing from the Middlesex County Probate Court. The date stamped in the upper right corner was January 14th. That was exactly 2 months after I had walked out into the freezing rain with my duffel bag. I read the text printed beneath the state seal. It was an emergency petition for conservatorship. Brenda had not just complained to the neighbors. She had hired a lawyer and filed sworn affidavits claiming I was a vulnerable, incapacitated adult. She wrote that I had vanished during a severe psychological crisis. She asked the presiding judge to grant her immediate unilateral control over my medical decisions and my future financial assets. She argued that since I was missing and mentally unfit, the court needed to appoint her as my legal guardian to protect any property I might inherit. She was laying the groundwork to steal Helen's house before the deed ever had a chance to reach my hands. I looked up at Mrs. Gable. The retired county clerk was watching me read, her expression grim and steady. She almost got away with it, Mrs. Gable said. Probate courts are notoriously cautious. When a respected, wealthy mother from Concord stands in front of a judge weeping and begging for the legal authority to save her runaway daughter, the system usually bends to her will. Brenda had her lawyer draft a flawless narrative. She was inches away from securing a court order that would have given her the power to liquidate your inheritance the second you turned 25. I set the petition down. My fingertips felt cold. How did you stop her? I asked. Mrs. Gable took a sip of her coffee. I did my job, she replied. Helen appointed me as the executor because I spent 30 years working in the county clerk office. I know every judge, every filing clerk, and every loophole in the Massachusetts legal system. When Brenda filed that emergency petition, I hired a ruthless corporate litigator using funds from Helen's estate. We walked into that courtroom and presented the ironclad terms of the irrevocable trust. I informed the judge that the beneficiary was not incapacitated, but simply estranged. Since Brenda could not physically produce you for a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, the judge threw her petition out. The legal firewall held. She could not touch the deed. A normal person would accept defeat after being thrown out of a courtroom. A normal person would realize their scheme had failed and walk away. But Brenda Coleman was not a normal person. When she realized she could not own the property legally, she decided to exploit it illegally. The house in Lexington is a stunning 4-bedroom Victorian property. It sits on a quarter-acre lot near the historical town green. It features original stained glass windows, a wraparound porch, and a market value hovering around $700,000. When Helen passed away, the house sat empty. As the trustee, Mrs. Gable was legally responsible for paying the property taxes and maintaining the lawn, but she could not sell it or transfer it until I came forward to claim it. When I turned 25, the trust was triggered. The house was supposed to become mine. But I was hiding in Boston, working my way up the corporate ladder, completely unaware that an asset worth $750,000 was waiting for me. Brenda capitalized on my absence. She possessed an old spare key from the months when Helen was undergoing chemotherapy. While Mrs. Gable was tied up with administrative duties, Brenda drove to Lexington and simply unlocked the front door. She bypassed licensed real estate agents. She avoided property management companies. She went online and posted a private listing for a premium rental property in one of the most elite school districts in the state. She found a family relocating from out of state who needed immediate housing. She drafted a fraudulent lease agreement using fake letterhead. She smiled, shook their hands, and told them she was managing the property on behalf of a sick relative. She demanded the rent be paid in certified cashier checks or cash, $4,000 a month. For 36 months, my mother illegally collected rent on a house she did not own. She pocketed nearly $150,000 in stolen revenue. I sat back in the leather booth. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. It was textbook fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. I asked Mrs. Gable why she did not just call the police and have Brenda arrested for trespassing. Mrs. Gable shook her head. "It is not that simple in real estate law," she explained. Brenda produced the fraudulent lease. The tenants had established residency. In Massachusetts, evicting a family requires months of housing court litigation. More importantly, as the trustee, my power was limited. I needed the actual beneficiary to step forward and claim the title to press criminal charges for the theft. I was stonewalled. "I spent 3 years searching for you, paying the property taxes out of the remaining trust funds just to keep the town from foreclosing on the house." I processed the timeline. My mother was running a shadow operation right under the nose of the legal system. But Brenda was already married to a successful man. They lived in a pristine colonial house. Why would she take on the risk of multiple federal felonies for an extra $4,000 a month? I found the answer buried in the third stack of papers on the table. It was Jessica. My golden child sister had not outgrown her chaotic lifestyle. The credit card theft was just a warm-up. 3 years ago, Jessica attended a mixer at a local country club. She drank too much, got behind the wheel of her imported sedan, and caused a severe collision on a suburban intersection. She injured the other driver. The victim filed a massive personal injury lawsuit against her. Jessica was facing criminal gross negligence charges and civil ruin. Her insurance refused to cover the damages due to her impairment. She was looking at bankruptcy and genuine jail time. Brenda could not allow her perfect daughter to become a convicted felon. She needed liquid cash to pay off the civil settlement, bribe the best defense attorneys in Boston, and keep the victim quiet out of court. David refused to drain his retirement accounts to save his reckless daughter, so Brenda drained my ghost instead. She used the illegal rent money from Aunt Helen's house to launder Jessica's sins. She stole the legacy my aunt left for me, the safety net meant to protect my future, and she handed it directly to the sister who had tried to ruin my past. My family had not just smeared my name in Concord, they had robbed me while I was busy surviving the poverty they forced me into. I stared at the cafe window. The morning commuters were rushing by holding their briefcases and coffees, completely unaware of the invisible wars people fight in quiet booths. Mrs. Gable reached into her trench coat one final time. "The clock ran out on Brenda 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was laced with a quiet, triumphant steel. The trust funds allocated for the property taxes finally ran dry. I could not delay the legal mechanism any longer. I went to the county clerk office and forced the execution of the deed transfer in absentia. "I filed the paperwork directly under your social security number." She slid a single sheet of heavy embossed paper across the table. It was the official property deed. My name, Ariana Coleman, was printed on the ownership line in black ink. "You are the sole undisputed legal owner of the Lexington property," Mrs. Gable said. "Brenda has zero standing. She is currently collecting rent on a house that belongs entirely to the daughter she told the world was crazy." Mrs. Gable reached into her blue clutch and pulled out a heavy brass key. She placed it directly in the center of the deed. "I just needed to find you to hand over the keys," she said softly. I picked up the brass key. The metal was cold against my palm. I closed my fist around it, feeling the jagged edges press into my skin. For 5 years, I had built my life around the assumption that I was an orphan. I thought my only defense against my toxic family was a silent retreat. I thought the best I could ever do was hide behind the walls of my Brookline apartment and hope they never found me. I was wrong. I was not the prey anymore. I held the deed to the ground my mother was standing on. I held the power to dismantle her entire fraudulent empire with a single piece of paper. Brenda had built a house of cards on the assumption that I would always be the terrified, broken girl running through the rain. She had no idea that the girl was gone. She had no idea she was about to deal with a corporate account director who managed multi-million-dollar crises before breakfast. I placed the documents back into the manila envelope. I put the brass key in my purse. I stood up from the cafe booth. I looked at Mrs. Gable and thanked her for keeping the firewall intact. I walked out of the coffee shop and stepped onto the cobblestone street. I did not hail a cab to my office. I did not check my work email. I walked straight back to my apartment. I sat on my velvet sofa, pulled out my phone, and unblocked the phone number I had avoided for half a decade. It was time to make a phone call. I walked out of the coffee shop on Charles Street and stepped into the crisp morning air. The city of Boston felt entirely different to me now. For the past 5 years, I navigated these streets like a refugee hiding from a storm. Now I walk the pavement as a property owner. I carried a deed worth $750,000 inside my leather purse. The heavy brass key pressed against the lining of my bag with every step I took. I did not take the subway. I did not go back to my office. I pulled out my phone, sent a brief message to my assistant, clearing my afternoon schedule, and hired a private car service to drive me back to my apartment in Brookline. During the ride, I watched the Charles River glide past the window. I thought about the instrument of control my mother used best: the telephone. In the Coleman household, Brenda weaponized the phone. She used it to coordinate her social standing. She used it to spread the rumors about my mental state to the entire extended family. She used it to negotiate the fraudulent lease for Aunt Helen's house. The phone was her scepter. It was only fitting that I use the same instrument to dethrone her. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped into the quiet sanctuary I had built. I took off my blazer and draped it over the back of a dining chair. I walked into the living room and sat down on my velvet sofa. I placed the manila envelope on the coffee table right in front of me. I pulled my phone from my pocket. For half a decade, the 10-digit number associated with the house in Concord was a source of pure terror. In the early days of my escape, just seeing a local area code pop up on my screen would send my heart rate spiking into a dangerous rhythm. I used to keep my phone on silent, so I would not have to hear the sudden ring. I opened my settings. I navigated to the block list. I scrolled down the screen until I found the contact labeled Brenda. I tapped the unblock button. I pressed dial. I put the phone to my ear. The line rang once. It rang twice. I expected the call to go to voicemail. I expected my father David to pick up and offer his usual cowardly silence. The line clicked open. Ariana. Her voice floated through the speaker. It was breathtaking how quickly she slipped into character. Brenda did not sound shocked to hear from her runaway daughter after 5 years of total silence. She did not sound angry. She sounded breathless, fragile, and overflowing with manufactured maternal relief. It was the exact calculated performance she gave to the neighbors standing near the floral department at the grocery store. She genuinely believed I was calling because my life had fallen apart. She assumed the crazy, unstable girl had finally hit rock bottom and was crawling back to the nest for shelter. "Oh, my sweet girl," Brenda whispered. Her voice trembled, a flawless theater trick designed to elicit guilt. "I have been praying for this day. Are you finally ready to come home and get the help you need?" 5 years ago, that condescending, sugary tone would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have screamed into the receiver. I would have desperately tried to defend my sanity. I would have demanded an apology for the credit card fraud. I would have given her the exact emotional reaction she craved. Toxic people feed on your desperation to be understood. If you argue with them, you validate their power. But I was not 23 anymore. I was a corporate account director who regularly negotiated hostile vendor contracts and managed high-stakes crises. I knew how to handle a manipulator. You do not argue with a wall. You present the wall with a wrecking ball. I did not raise my voice. I kept my posture relaxed against the sofa cushions. I kept my tone as flat, factual, and detached, as if I were canceling a catering order for a difficult corporate client. "Hello, Brenda," I said. "I am not calling to discuss my health. I am calling to give you a formal 60-day notice." A slight hesitation echoed on the line. The maternal act faltered for a fraction of a second, thrown off by my icy delivery. "Notice for what?" she asked. The sweetness in her voice thinned out rapidly, replaced by a razor edge of suspicion. "You need to evict the tenants at Aunt Helen's house in Lexington," I replied. "I am selling my property." The silence that followed was not just a pause in the conversation. It was a suffocating, glorious vacuum. It was the sound of a 5-year lie colliding head-on with a concrete wall of legal reality. I sat on my sofa, crossed my legs, and listened to the dead air. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as the truth washed over her. She realized her shadow operation was exposed. She realized I knew about the blind trust. She realized I knew about the fraudulent lease she signed. She realized her emergency guardianship petition had failed permanently, and the retired county clerk next door had beaten her. Brenda always operated under the assumption that she was the smartest person in any room. She relied on the compliance and fear of the people around her. David stayed quiet to keep the peace. Jessica played along to get her debts paid. I ran away because I was terrified. Brenda never accounted for the possibility that the daughter she discarded would return holding the ultimate trump card. Then a sound erupted through the speaker that I had never heard in my 28 years of life. Brenda Coleman broke down. It did not start as a scream. It started as a wet, gasping heave. The calculated, poised matriarch of Concord shattered into pieces. She began sobbing uncontrollably. These were not the delicate, sympathetic tears she used to manipulate her book club. This was the raw, ugly panic of a cornered predator realizing the trap had just snapped shut on its own leg. The sound was pathetic. For my entire childhood, this woman had projected an aura of invincible authority. She controlled our family with a velvet fist, dictating reality and punishing anyone who dared to question her narrative. Now she was hyperventilating over a cell phone connection, her breathing ragged and shallow. The fortress she built out of stolen money and forged leases was crumbling beneath her feet. She tried to catch her breath. The phone rustled loudly, as if she had dropped the receiver onto the granite kitchen counter and scrambled to pick it up with shaking hands. "No!" She gasped, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "No, you cannot do that. You do not understand what is happening here. You cannot take that house." "I understand everything, Brenda," I replied, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I have the official deed. I have the paper trail. I have the copy of the fraudulent lease you signed. You have 60 days to clear the property." The sobbing abruptly stopped. The tears dried up the instant she realized they were not working on me. The facade of the worried mother vanished entirely, leaving behind the true face of the woman I ran away from. She was staring down the barrel of federal fraud charges, tax evasion, and a ruined reputation in a town that valued status above all else. She started speaking a mile a minute. She launched into a frantic, desperate spin. She tried to change the narrative. She tried to justify her crimes by shifting the focus to her golden child. And the things she said next proved exactly why I could never show her a single ounce of mercy. The tears dried up the instant Brenda realized they were not working. The shift was immediate and terrifying. One second she was playing the role of the wounded, desperate mother, and the next second, the sweet facade dissolved entirely. The silence on my end of the line forced her to drop the act. She could not manipulate a brick wall. "You cannot do this!" Brenda shrieked into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, laced with the raw panic of a cornered animal. The polished Concord matriarch was gone. In her place was a frantic woman watching her fraudulent empire turn to ash. "Jessica needs that rent money," Brenda yelled, her breath hitching as she spoke. "She is drowning, Ariana. She is facing another lawsuit. The lawyers are demanding a retainer we cannot afford. If we do not pay them by the end of the month, she is going to lose everything. You have a good job in Boston. You do not need this house. We are your family." I sat on my velvet sofa and let her words wash over me. I did not interrupt her. I listened to the frantic rhythm of her demands, studying her tactics the same way I would study a hostile vendor trying to breach a contract. There it was, the ultimate toxic currency. We are family. In a healthy household, the word family means a foundation of mutual support, safety, and unconditional love. In the Coleman household, the word family was a weapon. It was a collection agency. It was the guilt trip Brenda used to extract resources from the scapegoat to cover the failures of the golden child. Growing up, whenever Jessica made a catastrophic mistake, the burden of the consequence was always shifted to me under the guise of family solidarity. When Jessica totaled her leased sedan at 19 because she was texting while driving, Brenda forced me to empty my high school savings account to pay the insurance deductible. When I asked why I had to pay for a crash I did not cause, Brenda told me that family helps family. Jessica was always drowning. She never learned how to swim because Brenda always drained the pool to save her. My role was simply to provide the buckets of water. I looked at the thick manila envelope resting on my coffee table. I thought about the 3 years my mother spent illegally collecting $4,000 a month from a property that belonged to me. I thought about the stolen identity, the ruined credit score, and the freezing rain. "You told the entire town I was unstable, Brenda," I said. My voice was low, steady, and devoid of any warmth. "You stood in the grocery store and cried to the neighbors about your missing, insane daughter. You hired a lawyer and tried to legally declare me incompetent to steal an inheritance from a dead woman. That is not a family. That is a cartel." The word cartel hung in the air between us. It was the truest thing I had ever said to her. A cartel protects its own elite members at the expense of everyone else, operating on blind loyalty and ruthless enforcement. Brenda was the boss. David was the silent enabler. Jessica was the protected asset. I was just the mark. Brenda started to hyperventilate. The realization that I knew the granular details of her emergency guardianship petition sent her into a tailspin. She knew she could not deny the court filings. The paper trail was already in my hands. Since the guilt trip failed, she immediately pivoted to her third tactic. She tried to negotiate. "Please, Ariana," Brenda begged, lowering her voice to a frantic whisper. "Let us just be reasonable about this. We do not need to involve lawyers. We do not need to evict the tenants. The family living there is very nice. We can work out an arrangement. We can be partners." I stared at the ceiling of my apartment. The sheer audacity of her proposal was breathtaking. She was trying to frame her federal real estate fraud as a joint business venture. "I collect the rent on the first of the month," Brenda continued, her words tumbling over each other in her rush to secure a deal. "I can send you a portion of it. I will send you $1,000 a month. Think about it, Ariana. That is a generous allowance." You can use it for shopping. You can use it for whatever you want. Just let me keep managing the property for Jessica. You know your Aunt Helen would want us to share. An allowance. She offered me $1,000 allowance out of my own $700,000 asset. I closed my eyes. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over my mind. In that single insulting offer, I realized exactly how Brenda viewed me. She genuinely believed she was negotiating with a ghost. She was talking to the terrified 23-year-old girl she had chased out into the rain half a decade ago. She still saw me as the powerless, easily manipulated scapegoat who would accept any crumb of validation she tossed my way. She had no concept of the woman sitting on the other end of the line. She did not know about the brutal night shifts at the diner. She did not know about the corporate promotions, the intense budget forecasting, or the relentless focus that built my current life. She did not know she was negotiating with a Boston account director who managed multi-million-dollar logistics. She thought $1,000 and the illusion of her approval would buy my compliance. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger requires an emotional investment. Anger means you still care about the other person's opinion. I only felt a cold, clinical detachment. I was looking at a broken machine that only knew how to run one specific manipulative program. I do not need an allowance, Brenda, I said. I own the house. I hold the deed. The trust is dissolved and your fraudulent lease is legally void. Ariana, please listen to me, Brenda shrieked, her voice rising an octave in pure desperation. You are ruining your sister. You are destroying her future over a house you do not even live in. I am not destroying Jessica, I replied. Jessica is experiencing the natural consequences of her own actions, and for the first time in her life, I am not going to pay the bill. I stood up from my velvet sofa. I walked over to the large window in my living room and looked out at the tree-lined street below. The autumn leaves were bright orange and yellow. The world outside my fortress was calm, steady, and moving forward. You have 60 days, Brenda, I said. If the tenants are not out by then, the eviction will be handled by the authorities and the fraudulent lease you signed will be handed directly to the district attorney. Wait, Brenda screamed into the phone. Do not hang up on me, Ariana. Do not you dare hang up on your mother. I am warning you. I moved the phone away from my ear. The frantic, shrieking voice of the woman who used to control my entire reality sounded incredibly small coming through the tiny speaker. I tapped the red button on the screen. The call ended. The silence returned to my apartment. It was not the heavy, anxious silence of the Concord house. It was the clean, quiet peace of a battle that had just been decisively won. I placed the phone down on the coffee table next to the manila envelope. I knew the war was not over yet. Desperate people do not simply pack up their schemes and walk away quietly. Brenda had spent 3 years relying on that illegal rental income to keep Jessica out of prison. She was going to fight. She was going to try to find a loophole or forge a document or deploy her Concord lawyers to stall the eviction process. She was going to spin a new web of lies to protect her golden child. I could not afford to give her an inch of breathing room. My mother spent her entire life using emotions to manipulate people. I needed to respond with something that possessed no emotions at all. I needed the cold, unfeeling machinery of the American legal system. It was time to hire the most ruthless real estate attorney in the city of Boston. Toxic systems rely heavily on secrecy. They depend on the unspoken agreement that all the mess, all the manipulation, and all the theft stays strictly behind closed doors. The Coleman family operated like a sealed circuit. Brenda controlled the narrative because she was the only one holding the microphone. To break a sealed circuit, you do not argue with the wires. You introduce a high-voltage shock from the outside. I did not need a therapist to handle my family. I needed a shark. Monday morning, I walked into a glass and steel high-rise in the Boston Financial District. I took the elevator to the 34th floor. I had an appointment with Mr. Caldwell. He was a senior partner at a boutique law firm specializing in high-net-worth estate litigation and hostile real estate disputes. He was 60 years old, wore a tailored gray suit, and possessed the cold clinical demeanor of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness. He did not handle amicable family mediations. He handled wars. He did not offer me a cup of coffee. He did not ask me how I was feeling. He pointed to the leather chair across from his glass desk and asked for the paperwork. I opened my purse and handed him the contents of Mrs. Gable's envelope. I gave him the irrevocable trust document. I gave him the official deed with my name printed on the ownership line. I handed him the failed emergency guardianship petition from 5 years ago. Finally, I placed the copy of the fraudulent residential lease Brenda had signed right in the center of his desk. Mr. Caldwell put on his reading glasses. The corner office was silent except for the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling a lingering, irrational wave of anxiety. A small leftover piece of my childhood conditioning wondered if this sophisticated attorney was going to look at the papers, shake his head, and tell me my mother was right. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Instead, Mr. Caldwell took off his glasses, set them on the glass desk, and let out a sharp, dry laugh. It was not a warm sound. It was the sound of a predator spotting an injured animal wandering in the open. He looked at me and shook his head. "Your mother is remarkably arrogant," he said, "and unfortunately for her arrogance leaves a very clear paper trail." He laid the fraudulent lease right next to the official deed. "Brenda has zero legal standing," he explained, tapping the paper with his index finger. "None. She is not the trustee, she is not the executor, she is not the property owner. By drafting this lease and collecting $4,000 a month, she has committed multiple counts of fraud. She is guilty of wire fraud if the tenants paid electronically. She is guilty of tax evasion for unreported income. She is impersonating a property manager. She is a civilian who broke into a house and started charging admission." I felt the last invisible chain tethering me to my family shatter into dust. For my entire life, Brenda had positioned herself as the ultimate authority. She was the judge, the jury, and the executioner in our home. Hearing a respected legal expert reduce her grand, terrifying schemes to a series of sloppy, easily prosecutable crimes was the most validating experience of my life. She was not a criminal mastermind. She was just a thief with good posture. Mr. Caldwell picked up a silver pen. "What is our objective here, Ariana?" he asked. "Do you want to refer this to the district attorney and press criminal charges?" I looked out the large window at the cargo ships moving across the harbor. Sending my mother to federal prison would certainly be poetic justice. But criminal trials take years. They require depositions, cross-examinations, and endless days sitting in a courtroom breathing the same air as the Coleman family. I wanted indifference, not a lifelong vendetta. I wanted a clean break. "I just want my property cleared," I replied. "I want them locked out permanently. And I want them to know that if they ever come near me again, I will drop the hammer." Mr. Caldwell nodded. He turned to his computer keyboard and began typing. He drafted 2 distinct instruments of legal warfare. The first was a formal 60-day notice to vacate for the tenants currently living in the Lexington house. I felt a deep pang of sympathy for that family. They were innocent bystanders caught in Brenda's web. They thought they were renting from a legitimate landlord. To soften the blow, Mr. Caldwell included a clause offering them a full refund of their original security deposit, paid directly out of my own pocket, provided they vacated the premises without causing any damage. It was a strategic move. It ensured they would leave quickly, and it redirected their inevitable anger entirely toward Brenda, the woman who had scammed them. The second document was the masterpiece. It was a cease and desist letter addressed directly to Brenda and David Coleman. I read over his shoulder as the printer spit out the heavy pages. It did not contain a single ounce of emotion. It did not mention the freezing rain, the stolen credit card, or the neighborhood smear campaign. It was written in the sterile, terrifying language of federal statutes and civil liabilities. The letter explicitly informed my parents that the true owner of the Lexington property was now aware of their illegal leasing operation. It demanded that all rent collections cease immediately. It dictated that any further contact with the tenants would be considered witness tampering. It laid out a very clear, non-negotiable boundary. If Brenda or David attempted to vandalize the property, if they removed a single light fixture, or if they tried to interfere with the legal eviction process, In any way, my legal counsel would immediately turn the fraudulent lease and the financial records over to the state prosecutor for embezzlement and criminal fraud. We did not send the letters through standard mail. We used registered mail with restricted delivery and signature confirmation. Brenda could not claim the letter was lost in the post. She could not pretend she never saw it. The postal carrier would require her to look them in the eye, sign her name on a digital pad, and physically accept the envelope. She was going to have to sign for her own checkmate. I left the financial district that afternoon feeling lighter than air. My mother spent her whole life using emotions to manipulate people. She relied on guilt trips, raised voices, and theatrical tears. But Mr. Caldwell and I used registered mail and court letterhead. You can gaslight a teenager. You can gaslight a neighborhood book club. You cannot gaslight a legal deed. Aunt Helen had drawn the blueprints and laid the foundation for an impenetrable fortress. I was finally pulling up the drawbridge. 3 days later, I sat at my desk in my home office and watched the tracking numbers update on my computer screen. Delivered. Signature acquired. The trap was sprung. The legal threat was so severe, so airtight, that it achieved the impossible. It actually silenced my parents. Brenda did not call to scream. David did not text to negotiate. The sheer magnitude of their legal exposure forced them into a terrified retreat. They realized that one wrong move would end with them in handcuffs. But shutting down the illicit cash flow created a new immediate problem. The Lexington rent money was the only thing keeping the golden child afloat. Brenda and David might have been scared into silence by Mr. Caldwell, but Jessica did not understand the concept of legal peril. She only understood that her personal bank account had just been permanently disconnected. Jessica felt entitled to everything she wanted. She never had to face the consequences of her actions because Brenda always shielded her. Now the shield was gone, and Jessica was about to turn her fury directly on the sister she had spent her life destroying. Being the golden child is its own specific type of prison. The victim never notices the bars because the cell is painted gold. For 3 decades, Brenda spent every waking moment removing every single obstacle from my older sister's path. If Jessica failed a class, Brenda yelled at the teacher until the grade was changed. If Jessica acquired a speeding ticket, Brenda paid the fine before David even saw the mail. When you are shielded from every natural consequence of your own actions, you never develop a spine. You never build resilience. You just develop an insatiable appetite for other people's resources. When Mr. Caldwell sent that cease and desist letter, he did not just cut off a revenue stream. He severed the life support system keeping Jessica out of prison. Brenda could no longer write the checks required to clean up her favorite daughter's mess. For the first time in her life, Jessica was staring down the barrel of her own catastrophic choices. The protective bubble had officially popped, and true to her nature, Jessica did not look inward to figure out how to fix her own problem. She did not take responsibility. She looked around for someone to blame, and she aimed her sights directly at the scapegoat. 2 days after the registered letters landed in Concord, my phone screen lit up. I was sitting at the desk in my Brookline home office. I was reviewing a catering contract for an upcoming corporate summit, enjoying a cup of herbal tea. The caller identification displayed a number I had not seen in half a decade. It was my sister. I watched the phone vibrate across the smooth surface of my desk. I let it ring. It stopped. Then it rang again. She called 6 times in a row. She was treating my phone line the same way she treated customer service workers at retail stores, ringing incessantly until someone gave her what she wanted. The red notification bubble appeared on my screen, indicating a new voicemail. I placed my pen down, leaned back in my chair, and pressed play. I put the phone on speaker. I expected a lot of things. I thought perhaps she might offer a fake hollow apology for the $8,000 she stole from my credit card 5 years ago. I thought she might pretend to be happy to hear my voice. I thought she might attempt to charm me into helping her. But narcissism strips a person of their basic social awareness. Jessica did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She led with pure, unfiltered entitlement. She shrieked into the receiver. Her voice was shrill and distorted by panic. She told me I was ruining her life. She screamed that our mother was using the Lexington rent money to pay the retainer for her defense attorneys. The civil lawsuits from her collision were draining her accounts. If I took the property back, she was going to have to declare bankruptcy. She would be forced to face her criminal charges without top-tier legal representation. She told me I was being incredibly selfish. She said she had seen my LinkedIn profile. She knew I had a great job in Boston. She said I did not even need the extra income. She called me a selfish brat for tearing the family apart over a piece of property I did not even live in. I sat back in my chair and listened to the recording loop a second time. It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon to witness an abuser operating in the wild. They always accuse you of doing exactly what they are actively doing to you. Jessica was calling me selfish for claiming an asset that legally belonged to me. Meanwhile, she felt entirely entitled to a house that was not hers to pay for crimes she committed using the sister she had happily thrown under the bus to save herself. She wanted me to surrender $750,000 so she could avoid taking accountability for driving under the influence. The sheer magnitude of the delusion was almost impressive. She genuinely believed that her legal fees were my responsibility. She believed that my financial stability was something she could simply harvest. 5 years ago, a voicemail like that would have triggered a severe panic attack. I would have felt the crushing weight of unearned guilt. I would have laid awake all night trying to figure out how to explain myself to her. I would have drafted long text messages trying to defend my character. I would have felt responsible for her tears. But time and distance provide a profound clarity. I was no longer the designated punching bag programmed to absorb their sins. I was an independent woman listening to a criminal throw a temper tantrum because her stolen funds had been cut off. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I only felt a deep, profound pity for a 30-year-old woman who still needed her mother to steal lunch money for her. I did not reply. Responding to an attack like that is exactly what they want. They want to drag you into the mud because they know how to fight in the mud. They want you to argue. If you engage, you give them a target. You give them something to twist and use against you. I refused to descend to her level. I refused to give her the satisfaction of hearing my voice. Instead, I activated the transcription feature on my phone. I captured an image of the entire vitriolic message converted into plain text. I attached the audio file and the screenshot to a new email. I typed a single sentence in the subject line. Addition to the Coleman harassment file. I hit send and routed it directly to the inbox of Mr. Caldwell. My lawyer was compiling a robust legal dossier of their behavior. Every unhinged voicemail, every threatening text, and every frantic email was being meticulously cataloged. If they tried to step foot on my property, or if they attempted to retaliate in any physical way, we would simply hand the entire file over to a judge to secure a permanent restraining order. I was building a paper wall around my life reinforced by evidence. I deleted the voicemail from my device. I picked up my pen and went back to reviewing my catering contracts. I let her scream into the void. The power of being a ghost is that you cannot be threatened, you cannot be blackmailed, and you cannot be forced to care. Ghosts do not negotiate. Jessica realized very quickly that her intimidation tactics were useless. Her calls went unanswered. Her text messages were met with cold silence. The golden child was finally learning that her tears held no currency in the real world. She could not bully me into submission. When her direct attack failed, the toxic family system had to adapt. The machine was running out of options. Brenda was legally gagged by the cease and desist letter from my attorney. Jessica was ignored and blocked. They had exhausted their usual arsenal of guilt trips and hysterical rage. But they had one more card to play. They realized that screaming at me was ineffective. They needed a different approach. They needed someone who appeared reasonable. They needed someone who could disguise their toxic demands as a polite plea for peace. They needed a Trojan horse, so they sent in the one person who had spent his entire life mastering the art of quiet complicity. They sent in the man who preferred to watch the fire burn rather than pick up a bucket of water. They sent in my father. When a toxic system realizes that screaming and intimidation no longer work, it undergoes a rapid and predictable transformation. The aggressive tactics are shelved, the system recalibrates and deploys its final defense mechanism: It sends in the diplomat. It sends the person who wears the mask of a peacekeeper, the one who pretends to be reasonable, the one who relies on your lingering sense of obligation to pull you back into the fold. In the Coleman family, that person was David. My father was the great silent enabler. Growing up, I used to think David was just a victim of Brenda and her controlling nature. I used to feel sorry for him. I thought he was trapped in the same house I was, keeping his head down just to survive her wrath. It took me years of distance to understand the true anatomy of an enabler. An enabler is not a victim. An enabler is a silent partner. David chose to live in a pristine colonial house. He chose the country club memberships and the quiet Sunday afternoons, reading flyers in the kitchen. To maintain that comfortable, frictionless lifestyle, he had to pay a toll to his wife. And the toll was my safety. He offered up his youngest daughter as a sacrifice to keep Brenda pacified. Enablers are often more dangerous than the primary abuser because they validate the abuse by refusing to stop it. They look you right in the eye while the house is burning and tell you to ignore the smoke. On a Tuesday evening, a few days after Jessica left her unhinged voicemail, I was standing in my Brookline kitchen making dinner. Outside, a heavy autumn rain was washing over the city streets. The rhythm of the rain hitting the glass reminded me of the night I walked away from Concord. I was chopping vegetables on a butcher block, enjoying the warmth of my own home when my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen illuminated. It was a text message from David. It was the first direct communication I had received from my father in 5 years. I put down my knife. I wiped my hands on a towel. I picked up the device and read the long, meandering block of text he had sent. It was a masterpiece of passive manipulation. Ariana, the message began, "Your mother is a mess." I read that first sentence and actually smiled, a cold, humorless smile. Notice the framing. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about the 5 years I spent surviving in Boston. His opening line was a complaint that his own peace had been disturbed. Brenda was likely pacing the floors, screaming at the walls, and making his life uncomfortable because her illegal operation had been exposed. David was reaching out to me, not to repair our relationship, but to ask me to fix his wife, so he could go back to reading his hardware flyers in silence. The text continued. Jessica is crying every day. Once again, the golden child and her discomfort took center stage. David wanted me to feel guilty because the sister who stole my identity and drove drunk was currently shedding tears over her impending bankruptcy. Then came the coward's favorite sentence. I know mistakes were made. Mistakes were made. That is the passive voice of a man who refuses to look at his own reflection. He did not write your mother committed fraud. He did not write your sister committed a felony. He did not write I failed to protect you. He phrased it as if the crimes were just vague weather-related phenomena that magically floated into our house and happened to land on me. The message went on. But you are tearing this family apart over a house. Can we not just sit down and work this out? The blame shift was breathtaking. I was the villain for holding the legal deed to my own property. I was the one tearing the family apart, not the woman who ran an illegal rental scam, and not the sister who drained the accounts. David wanted me to drop the 60-day eviction notice, withdraw the cease and desist letter from Mr. Caldwell, and come back to the table so they could slowly bleed my inheritance dry under the guise of working it out. And then at the very bottom of the screen, he delivered the closing line. Please be the bigger person. I set the phone down on the granite counter. I leaned forward and rested my weight on my hands. If you are listening to this and you have ever survived a dysfunctional family, you know exactly what that phrase means. Be the bigger person is a toxic family's favorite tool. It is a linguistic trap designed to keep you compliant. When an enabler tells you to be the bigger person, they are not asking you to take the moral high ground. They are asking you to shrink yourself. They are asking you to absorb the abuse, swallow the theft, and accept the disrespect so the abuser does not have to experience the natural consequences of their own actions. They want you to be the bigger person because they are too terrified to confront the smaller people making the mess. They expect you to prioritize the group's dysfunction over your own basic safety. I realized looking at that text message that David was never going to change. He was always going to prioritize his own comfort over my survival. He would gladly watch me hand over a $700,000 asset if it meant Brenda would stop yelling at him across the living room. I did not forward this message to Mr. Caldwell. This did not require a legal filing or a formal addition to the harassment dossier. This required a personal final conclusion. This was the last thread connecting me to the ghost of my childhood, and it was time to cut it. I picked up the phone. I did not use passive voice. I did not negotiate. I used active, undeniable verbs. I typed my reply. You sat at the kitchen table and let your wife call me crazy to steal my identity and my inheritance. Tearing the family apart is not my job. You did it 5 years ago. Do not contact me again. I read the words twice to ensure there was no emotion, no lingering plea for his understanding. It was a statement of historical fact. I hit send. The text bubble turned blue and vanished into the digital ether. Before he could even formulate a response, before he could show the screen to Brenda, or draft another cowardly excuse, I tapped his contact profile. I scrolled to the bottom of the menu. I pressed the red text that said, "Block caller." I placed the phone face down on the counter. I stood in my quiet, warm kitchen listening to the rain tap against the window pane. I waited for the guilt to hit me. Society conditions us to believe that cutting off a parent is a tragic, shameful act. We are told that blood is thicker than water and that closing the door on the people who raised you is an unnatural cruelty. I braced myself for the grief, but the grief never came. Instead, a heavy dark anchor fell away from my chest. My lungs expanded, pulling in a deep, clean breath of air. For 23 years, I had craved my father's protection. I had waited for him to stand up from his stool, take the credit card statement out of my hand, and defend me. I finally realized that I did not need his protection anymore. I had protected myself better than he ever could. I saved myself. I hired the lawyer. I secured the deed. I built a life that did not require his permission to exist. I did not owe them my peace. I did not owe them my inheritance. I owed myself a future. My family was now officially cut off. They could not reach me by phone. They could not reach me by email. The psychological warfare was over, and the digital gates were locked. They were trapped behind the legal wall Mr. Caldwell had built, with the clock ticking down on their 60-day eviction notice. But Brenda's problem was no longer just about me. My mother had spent 5 years constructing a tragic, sympathetic persona for the neighbors of Concord. She had built her entire social standing on the lie that she was the grieving mother of an unstable runaway. She forgot one crucial detail about the American legal system. An eviction notice is not a private text message. A 60-day notice to vacate a property due to fraudulent leasing is a documented public legal action. And in a wealthy, idle suburb like Concord, legal documents do not stay quiet for long. The Whisper Network was about to wake up, and my mother was about to discover what happens when you lose control of the narrative in a town that runs on gossip. Secrets in a wealthy New England suburb do not just leak, they explode. In a town like Concord, information does not travel through loud arguments in the street. It travels over manicured hedges, across the tables of charity luncheons, and through the quiet text message threads of neighborhood associations. Reputation is the only currency that truly matters to these people. If you have a pristine reputation, the town will forgive almost any private sin. But if you make the community look foolish, the town will excommunicate you overnight. Brenda spent 5 years building a very specific stage for herself. She wrote a script where she was the long-suffering tragic matriarch who tried to save her deeply troubled daughter. She extracted pity from every single person she met. The neighbors provided a steady stream of emotional support. They bought into the lie because Brenda sold it with flawless precision. But you cannot maintain a script when the supporting actors start reading from actual legal documents. The collapse of my mother's reputation began the moment Mr. Caldwell served the official eviction notice to the tenants living in the Lexington house. The tenants were a professional family. They were furious to discover they had been paying $4,000 a month to a woman who did not own the property. They hired their own attorney to review the cease and desist letter. Their attorney immediately contacted the local authorities to verify the deed and report the fraudulent lease. In Massachusetts, property records are public. Police reports regarding real estate fraud are not classified. The paper trail was suddenly visible to anyone who knew where to look. But public records need a catalyst to reach the gossip mill. They need a messenger. And the messenger was Mrs. Gable. The retired county clerk did not just sit on her porch and watch the grass grow. She was a founding member of the Concord Historical Garden Society. 2 weeks after I blocked my father's phone number, the society held their monthly meeting at the country club. Dozens of influential women sat around tables draped in white linen drinking tea and discussing local events. According to Elena, a colleague of mine whose aunt attended that very meeting, the conversation naturally drifted toward neighborhood updates. Someone brought up Brenda Coleman. A woman expressed sympathy for my mother, mentioning how hard it must be for Brenda to deal with a runaway, unstable child, while her other daughter Jessica was facing such terrible legal troubles. Mrs. Gable set her teacup down on its porcelain saucer. The delicate clink of the ceramic silenced the table. She looked at the women gathered around her and delivered a tactical strike of pure truth. Mrs. Gable informed the table that I was not a runaway, and I was certainly not unstable. She casually mentioned my new corporate title. She told them I was a successful account director at a premier event planning firm in Boston. The women were stunned. But Mrs. Gable did not stop there. She explained the mechanics of the Helen Coleman Irrevocable Trust. She laid out the timeline. She revealed that Helen had left her entire estate to me, and that Brenda had intercepted the preliminary paperwork. Mrs. Gable detailed the fraudulent lease. She explained that Brenda had been breaking into a house she did not own, acting as a fake landlord, and pocketing the cash to pay for Jessica's criminal defense lawyers. Mrs. Gable weaponized the truth in the most devastating way possible. She delivered the facts in a calm, flat tone, presenting the legal reality without a single ounce of emotion. The women at the country club started doing the math. The cognitive dissonance was jarring, but the numbers did not lie. They realized that my sudden disappearance 5 years ago aligned perfectly with Helen's death and the activation of the blind trust. They realized that Brenda's sudden influx of cash to hire expensive attorneys for Jessica came from nowhere. They remembered Brenda weeping in the floral department of the grocery store, asking for prayers while she was actively committing federal tax evasion. High society relies on polite illusions. But there is one thing wealthy suburbanites hate more than anything else in the world. They hate being conned. They hate realizing they were duped into providing their valuable sympathy and their expensive casseroles to a common thief. The news swept through the Concord neighborhood network like a wildfire burning through dry brush. By the end of the week, the social climate surrounding my parents' house dropped to absolute zero. Brenda did not receive an official notification that she had been exiled. The punishment was delivered through the agonizing slow drip of social isolation. It started with the phone. The house landline, which used to ring a dozen times a day with invitations to book clubs and dinner parties, went entirely silent. Her calendar emptied out. When Brenda tried to text her friends to confirm their weekly coffee dates, she received vague, polite excuses about scheduling conflicts. The true depth of her bankruptcy became apparent on a Tuesday afternoon at the local organic market. Brenda walked into the store wearing her usual pristine tennis outfit. She grabbed a shopping cart and headed toward the produce aisle. For years, this grocery store was her personal theater. It was the place where she held court, accepting the sympathetic nods of her peers. She turned the corner near the organic apples and saw a woman she had known for 15 years, a woman who had attended her summer barbecues. Brenda put on her practiced tragic smile and raised her hand to wave. The neighbor looked right at her. The neighbor did not smile. She did not wave back. She looked at Brenda with an expression of cold, naked disgust. The neighbor pulled her shopping cart backward, turned the wheels sharply, and walked down a different aisle without speaking a single word. Brenda stood frozen in the produce section. When she went to the checkout lane, the cashier avoided eye contact. The bag boy did not offer to help her carry her groceries to the car. The silence in the store was deafening. It was the sound of a community turning its back permanently. In a town where reputation is currency, Brenda Coleman was suddenly destitute. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of superiority. She controlled her husband, she controlled her daughters, and she controlled the narrative of our family. Now the mask was ripped off. Everyone knew exactly what she was. She was a fraud who tried to lock her youngest child in a psychiatric ward to steal a house. The psychological toll of that exposure was catastrophic. Brenda retreated into her colonial house and refused to leave. She pulled the blinds down. The velvet fist she used to rule our family lost its power because there was no one left to punch. David was trapped inside the dark house with her forced to endure the bitter, spiraling rage of a woman who had lost her audience. He had chosen the path of least resistance by enabling her for decades. Now his reward was a front-row seat to her unraveling. He could not retreat to his garage. He could not hide behind his hardware flyers. He was locked in a cage with the monster he helped feed. Jessica was equally isolated. Her primary funding source was severed. Without the illicit rent money pouring in, her defense attorneys dropped her case. She was forced to declare bankruptcy. The golden child was finally experiencing the cold reality of the world, without her mother running interference. I watched none of this happen in person. I did not drive past their house to gloat. I did not send them mocking text messages. I stayed in Boston, managing my corporate accounts, watering my plants, and living my life. I received the updates through brief, satisfying emails from Mr. Caldwell, who monitored the situation to ensure they complied with the legal directives. My indifference was the final nail in their coffin. I did not care if they suffered. I only cared that they were stopped. The 60-day notice period ticked down steadily. The calendar pages turned. Autumn faded into early winter. The crisp Boston air turned sharp and freezing, reminding me of the night I walked away with my duffel bag. The tenants in Lexington found a new property. Mr. Caldwell wired them their refunded security deposit directly from my account. They moved out quietly, leaving the Victorian house empty and secure. Day 60 finally arrived. The legal timeline had expired. The property was vacant. The fraudulent lease was officially dead. There was only one task left on the board. I had to travel to Lexington to perform the final walkthrough of the estate. I had to turn the brass key in the lock and physically reclaim the ground my Aunt Helen left for me. I knew it was not going to be a simple real estate transaction. My mother was stripped of her reputation, her illegal income, and her social standing. She had nothing left to lose. And a predator with nothing left to lose is a very dangerous thing. I put on my heavy winter coat, placed the official deed in my leather bag, and drove out to the suburbs. I was preparing to walk through the front door of my new property, but I was also preparing for a collision. The 60th day arrived with a bitter frost clinging to the windshield of my car. I woke up early in my Brookline apartment, drank a cup of coffee in the quiet warmth of my kitchen, and put on my heavy wool coat. I placed the official property deed and the heavy brass key into my leather bag. I walked down to the parking garage and started the engine. I merged onto the westbound highway, driving away from the city skyline and heading toward the affluent suburbs. The drive took exactly 42 minutes. As I crossed the town line into Lexington, the landscape shifted. The dense urban architecture gave way to winding tree-lined roads, historical markers, and sprawling residential estates. I navigated toward the historic green. Aunt Helen's Victorian house stood at the end of a quiet, picturesque cul-de-sac. It was a stunning piece of late 19th century architecture. The structure featured 3 stories of dark painted wood, an intricate wraparound front porch, and a distinct corner turret fitted with original stained glass windows. I pulled my car to the curb and parked. The driveway was empty. Mr. Caldwell had confirmed the previous evening that the tenants had packed their moving trucks, vacated the premises, and surrendered their temporary keys to a lockbox. The legal eviction was finalized without a single day of court litigation. I stepped out of my vehicle. The crisp winter air stung my cheeks. The neighborhood was enveloped in a profound, deep silence. I looked at the front steps where my aunt used to sit and read her thick biographies. For the first time in 5 years, I was not standing on borrowed ground. I was standing on my own territory. I reached into my bag and pulled out the brass key. I took 5 measured steps up the slate walkway. Then the harsh screech of tires shattered the morning quiet. A silver luxury sports utility vehicle swung around the corner of the cul-de-sac. It accelerated recklessly before slamming on the brakes, parking at a sharp angle directly behind my car, boxing me in. The driver's side door flung open. Brenda stepped onto the frozen pavement. I stopped walking. I turned around and looked at my mother. The woman standing 10 feet away from me was a stranger. For my entire life, Brenda Coleman curated her physical appearance with ruthless precision. She never checked the mailbox without applying lipstick. She treated her wardrobe as a uniform of superiority, but the woman glaring at me from the street had been stripped of her royal armor. The social exile of Concord had exacted a severe physical toll. Her hair was pulled back into a severe messy knot, exposing an inch of gray at the roots. She wore a heavy, shapeless coat over dark sweatpants. Her face looked haggard, drawn tight with exhaustion and bitter resentment. She lacked the polished, terrifying authority that used to dictate my every move. She looked small. She looked frantic. She did not approach the edge of the lawn. Mr. Caldwell had written the cease and desist letter very clearly. If she set foot on the property, she would be trespassing, and I would call the police. She hovered on the public sidewalk, her boots toeing the invisible property line. She clutched her leather purse against her chest like a shield. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She stared at the brass key in my hand, and her face contorted with a venomous rage. "You threw your own sister to the wolves," Brenda spat. Her voice echoed sharply in the cold air. "You stole the only thing keeping this family afloat. You took the rent money. You forced Jessica into bankruptcy. We are losing everything, and you are just standing there smiling." I was not smiling. My face was entirely blank. I observed her outburst the same way a scientist observes a chemical reaction behind a pane of thick safety glass. I realized in that moment that she still did not understand the reality of the situation. She still believed the house was a collective family asset that I had greedily snatched away. Her narcissism prevented her from accepting that she had committed a crime. In her mind, she was the martyr, and I was the ungrateful villain ruining her life. "You have no heart," she hissed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own fury. "You are a cold, selfish girl. You have no heart." 5 years ago, an accusation like that from my mother would have crushed me. It would have sent me spiraling into a desperate attempt to prove my empathy. I would have dropped the key, walked back to my car, and surrendered the house just to show her I was a good person. But 5 years of survival changes the architecture of your soul. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I felt an overwhelming wave of peace. I looked at the woman who tried to erase my existence. I looked at the mother who attempted to lock me in a psychiatric ward to cover a felony. "I have a heart, Brenda," I said. My voice was calm, carrying easily across the frosty lawn. "It is just not bleeding for you anymore." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back to her. I walked up the wooden stairs of the wraparound porch. I slid the heavy brass key into the front door lock. The metal tumblers engaged with a loud, satisfying click. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped over the threshold. I closed the door behind me. I turned the deadbolt. The sudden silence inside the house was deafening. The heavy wooden door severed the connection to the outside world instantly. I stood in the entryway and let out a long, slow breath. I did not yell. I did not cry. My hands were perfectly steady. I walked through the empty rooms of the property my aunt had left me. The tenants had hired a professional cleaning service before leaving. The hardwood floors gleamed in the morning sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The air smelled of floor wax, old pine wood, and cold dust. I walked into the front parlor. I traced my fingers along the edge of the original brick fireplace. I stood in the exact spot where Helen used to hand me books and tell me I had a sharp mind. She built this fortress for me because she knew a day would come when I would need a place where the Coleman family could never reach me. I walked over to the front window. The stained glass obscured the view slightly, but I could see the street outside. Brenda was still standing on the sidewalk. She stared at the heavy oak door for a long minute. She looked around the quiet, affluent neighborhood. She realized there was no audience here. There was no book club to manipulate. There were no neighbors to offer her sympathy casseroles. There was just a locked door, a legal deed, and a daughter who no longer feared her. She turned around, got back into her silver sports utility vehicle, and drove away. I watched her taillights disappear around the corner of the cul-de-sac. An overwhelming sense of safety settled over my shoulders. They could not touch me here. They could not touch me at my apartment in Brookline. They could not touch me at my corporate office in Boston. They could not touch me anywhere ever again. I spent 2 hours walking through the Victorian house. I checked the plumbing, inspected the antique fixtures, and verified the condition of the property. It was a stunning piece of real estate. It represented financial security, generational wealth, and the ultimate victory over my abusers. But as I stood in the empty master bedroom on the second floor, a new thought began to form in my mind. This house was a beautiful fortress, but it was also located just 15 miles away from Concord. It held the memories of my aunt, but it was also the physical asset that caused my mother to hunt me. It was an anchor tying me to a geographical location I had spent half a decade trying to escape. I did not want to be a landlord. I did not want to spend my weekends managing a historic property in the suburbs, constantly checking my security cameras to see if my family decided to violate the cease and desist order. The deed gave me power, but holding on to the physical building felt like carrying a heavy trophy. True freedom does not mean guarding a fortress forever. True freedom means converting the fortress into a bridge, walking across it, and burning the wood behind you. I pulled my phone out of my coat pocket. I scrolled through my professional contacts until I found the number for an elite commercial real estate broker I frequently worked with during my corporate event planning. I dialed the number. I listened to the phone ring in the empty, sunlit room. I was preparing to make the final move on the board. The game was over, but it was time to collect the ultimate payoff. I dialed the broker. She answered on the third ring. I gave her the address of the Lexington Victorian. She knew the street immediately. I told her I wanted it listed by Monday morning. She asked if I wanted to renovate or stage the interior to maximize the profit margin. I told her the house was empty, clean, and ready for the market exactly as it stood. I wanted a fast, seamless transaction. I did not want a lingering attachment to the suburbs. I wanted the asset liquidated. The property went live on the multiple listing service 4 days later. Lexington is a highly desirable real estate market. The school system is elite, and historic homes rarely sit vacant. We received 5 competitive offers within the first 48 hours. I did not entertain buyer letters or emotional appeals. I instructed my broker to accept the highest cash offer, waiving all contingencies. 3 months later, I sat in a sleek conference room at a title company in downtown Boston. I signed my name across a stack of closing documents. I handed over the heavy brass key. 2 hours after I left the title office, I opened the banking application on my phone. A wire transfer had cleared. The balance on my screen read $750,000. 5 years earlier, I sat on the floor of a damp basement in South Boston, staring at a bank balance of $34. I was suffocating under the weight of an $8,000 fraudulent credit card debt. Now I possessed $750,000 in liquid capital. The math of my life had fundamentally changed. When people come into a sudden windfall, the impulse is often to acquire loud, visible proof of their success. They buy imported sports cars. They purchase sprawling mansions with gates. They buy designer wardrobes to signal to the world that they have arrived. But when you spend years fighting for your basic survival, your definition of luxury changes. Luxury is not a logo. Luxury is security. Luxury is knowing that no one can ever pull the rug out from under you again. I did not buy a sports car. I kept driving my reliable sedan. I did not buy a sprawling mansion in the suburbs. I hired a fiduciary financial advisor. We took a conservative, disciplined approach. We invested a significant portion of the funds into a diversified index portfolio to ensure long-term growth. Then I bought my own permanent fortress. I purchased a beautiful, quiet townhome in a historic neighborhood in Boston. It features exposed brick walls, a genuine wood-burning fireplace, and a small private courtyard covered in ivy. It is not sprawling. It does not echo. It is warm, secure, and entirely mine. The deed is registered under a private holding company to protect my identity. The Coleman family cannot find my address on a public registry, but the most important investment I made did not yield a financial return. It yielded a human one. I allocated $50,000 to establish an endowed scholarship fund at a local women's college. I named it the Helen Coleman Memorial Grant. I worked with the University Financial Aid Office to set strict, specific criteria for the applicants. The grant is not based on academic excellence or athletic achievement. It is designed specifically for young women who are escaping domestic financial abuse. It is for the students whose parents use tuition money as a weapon of control. It is for the girls who are forced to take on fraudulent debt, the ones who check the box, stating they have zero family contribution because their families are actively trying to bankrupt them. Aunt Helen used her resources to build a firewall for me. I used her legacy to build firewalls for dozens of other young women. Every time a student uses that grant to pay for a semester of classes, a deposit on a safe apartment, or a legal consultation to untangle coerced debt, Brenda loses. Every single grant awarded is a victory over the toxic system my mother tried to uphold. While I was building my future, the past was settling its own debts. The universe has a remarkable way of balancing the scales provided you step back and let gravity do the work. I did not have to orchestrate my family's downfall. I just had to remove myself from the equation and let their own dysfunction consume them. Jessica ran out of runway. Without the illegal rent money from the Lexington house, she could not sustain her lifestyle or pay her defense attorneys. She officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy late that winter. Bankruptcy is a matter of public record. The court-appointed trustee liquidated her assets. They seized her luxury vehicle. They auctioned off her expensive jewelry. She was forced to move out of her upscale apartment and face the reality of her own reckless choices. The golden child was finally introduced to the concept of accountability, and the introduction was ruthless. Brenda and David did not fare much better. The social exile in Concord proved to be a terminal condition for their lifestyle. In a town where social currency dictates your quality of life, living as an outcast is a suffocating experience. The silent treatment Brenda weaponized against me for years was turned against her by the entire neighborhood. No one invited them to holiday parties. No one spoke to them at the country club. The isolation bred a deep, bitter resentment inside their pristine colonial house. The financial strain of Jessica's legal woes, combined with the loss of the illicit rental income, fractured their facade. Maintaining a large estate in Concord requires a steady flow of cash. They could no longer afford the property taxes, the landscaping services, and the country club dues. Less than a year after the charity gala, they listed the Concord house for sale. They packed up their expensive furniture, retreated from the town they used to rule, and downsized to a tiny, unremarkable condo in a different county. They live in a cramped space surrounded by the ghosts of their ruined reputation, exiled by their own community. They have no audience. They have no scapegoat. They only have each other. I am 28 years old today. I sit in my quiet courtyard in Boston, drinking my morning coffee, listening to the city wake up around me. I look at my bank account and I look at the walls of my home. But the most valuable thing I own is not the money Aunt Helen left me. It is not the townhome, and it is not my corporate title. The most valuable thing I own is the undeniable reality that I saved myself. When the fire started, I did not wait for my father to rescue me. I did not negotiate with the arsonist. I walked into the freezing rain and built my own shelter. If you are listening to this right now, I want to speak directly to you. If you are sitting at a family dinner table, where people are actively trying to convince you that your boundaries are selfish, you need to listen closely. If they tell you that you are dramatic or unstable or ungrateful simply because you refuse to let them steal your resources and your peace, I want you to hear this clearly. Walk away. Let them call you crazy. Let them spin their lies to the neighbors. Let them talk. The truth has a very long memory. The lies require constant maintenance, but the truth just waits. Eventually, the receipts always come due. You do not have to stay and fight a battle against people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your only obligation is to your own survival. The bravest thing you will ever do is stop handing buckets of water to people who are trying to drown you. I want to know your story. Tell me in the comments. What was the exact moment, the final straw that made you realize you had to walk away from a toxic person? Was it a stolen credit card, a whispered lie, or just the sudden realization that you deserved better? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one because your survival stories are the blueprints for the people who are still trying to find the exit. Thank you for listening. Keep building your fortress. I will see you in the next story. I am 28 years old and my life is finally my own. My mother and father live in a cramped condo entirely isolated by the town they used to rule. My sister is bankrupt, facing the reality of her choices without my mother's stolen money to shield her. I do not check up on them. I do not harbor any burning anger. I am just busy living. If this journey has taught me one undeniable lesson, it is this. You cannot heal in the same cage that was built to break you. For years, I thought being the bigger person meant shrinking myself to absorb their abuse. I was wrong. True strength is not enduring toxic people. It is having the courage to walk out into the freezing rain and refusing to look back. My aunt left me a physical house, but what I actually inherited was the power to finally choose myself. If you are listening to this and waiting for permission to leave a table where you are not respected, consider this your sign. You are allowed to walk away. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you found the strength you needed today, please subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more real-life narratives. I will see you in the next one.